Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I am your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I have a very exciting guest, as always, is Dr. Scott Stevenson. We're talking all about peak week. He recently released a fantastic study that went really deep over peak week, and this is an evidence-based guide, and there's a lot of poor information out there on peak week, so we get into a really fun discussion. Also, so you know, we have a really exciting program that we are launching very soon, and that is the mini cut movement. You may have heard of mini cuts, quick fat loss, efficient fat loss. Well, we are running a group coaching format where we're taking you through a really short mini cut to get fat off very efficiently. We're going to be guiding you through that process through Zoom calls with our coaches, and it's going to be really fun, really interactive, and of course, you're going to get really lean. So definitely check out the link below for the wait list so you know exactly when everything's going to be running. Now guys, enjoy the show. Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall. And for those watching, you will see I have Scott Stevenson back on the show. I was just checking back. I always like to check back when guests who have been on multiple times, like Scott's been on the podcast more than I can probably even count. It's maybe in the teens by now. Maybe not quite that many, but it will sometime. We'll keep going. So it was 30 episodes ago, pretty much. So it was episode 233, which was the end of last year, November last year. So it's crazy how fast time flies, especially when, I guess for you, you're doing podcasts quite regularly, just like me actually, but like on the other end quite often. And it's just crazy how fast the time can go between like being on different shows and having chats and things.
Yeah, for me, it's always sort of been because I try to be, to the extent I possibly can, be sort of natural. So sometimes I would literally forget. I can't remember if I had a conversation with someone or I did a podcast because they're one and the same in my mind. So anyway, I do speak like this in real life. If someone gets me going on that tangent, I'm not always, Mr. Sciencey guy. This is how I actually correspond and, have conversations. So, but yeah, it does all blur together for sure.
Yeah, I'm bad for that as well, but natural is best as well. So, and it's just a conversation. I think that's always the most enjoyable listen as well for people, rather than like a question, like a textbook answer or something. It's like this feels premeditated. What's going on here?
Yeah,
so
for sure.
I do have Scott on for a particular reason this week, because he recently published a study with Christopher Barakat. So you'll know Chris, who's been on the show, Alan Aragon, Brad Schoenfeld, who have been on the show as well. So yeah, he was part of this, and it was called Peak Week Recommendations for Bodybuilders, an Evidence-Based Approach, which is really kind of, I don't know, to me, I love the title because it's a case of peak week is one of those mysterious things for a lot of bodybuilders, I think. And I've actually recently been revisiting a lot of kind of pieces of material and interviews I've done with other guests, because it's getting to that time again where peak week is coming around later for bodybuilders. So I like to just refer back and give myself a reminder. And it's kind of interesting to hear where it came from in terms of like magazines and everything. And slowly but surely, we've actually got some evidence-based recommendations, which is amazing. And that's what we're going to be talking about. So Scott, I don't know if a good starting point would be for you to kind of introduce what the goal of peak week might be, and then maybe talk through, just summarize, because otherwise there's far too much detail for each of them, but summarize each kind of variable that you went over during kind of the peak week study.
Oh, geez. Yeah, there's actually quite a good number of sections, to be honest. So I need to first give credit to Guillermo Escalante. He was he spearheaded this whole thing. Yeah. Okay. Right. And I did a podcast with him just a few days ago. It should be out sometime soon too. But he sort of brought it all together, and they brought me in at at the end and said, okay, we've kind of been working on this for a little while, but we'd like to bring you in here. Can you put this together in like the next week? I'm like, well, yeah, I'm all over it. So the idea, of course, is from a physique perspective, you want to be as dry as possible, so to speak. So eliminate subcutaneous water specifically and be as full as possible. So you want to have as much volume in the muscle cells, and that's going to happen through loading glycogen and the associated water, as well as intramuscular triglycerides. So there's a fat loading thing that a lot of people hadn't heard about. It's sort of been used for years and years and years, but actually a really good rationale for this, that That was actually a section that I added. I'm like, we got to put some of this in here. So they very kindly, and even credit goes to the journal. We thought for sure this thing was going to be too long. Like, we're like, this is like, it's like 3 times as long as normally they'd want for a review like that.
Right.
But they let it be. You know, we got the right reviewers and who appreciated what we done. And so I think like like the fat loading and a couple other subsections, like there's a section on the head down tilt, which I added in there, which is something I started doing years ago, and I put in my Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach book.
Yep.
So we added some things. It's just like, it was just growing and growing and growing over time. So that's the basic idea. So we cover the importance of protein, carbohydrates, and fat in that context. We cover the importance of water and water manipulation, potentially, of course, as far as importance goes, and sodium, potassium, so electrolytes. Let me first say, because this is one of the big things that many people say, this is one of the sort of the contentious features of a peak week, is you really shouldn't have to do much of anything at all if you're really in shape. And that's absolutely, utterly the truth. If you're really just peeled, just completely skinned, there's no fat at all, then you look phenomenal almost under all conditions. And you can make slight manipulations to your water intake and even see something better. It's very evident. And you can drop water really rapidly too. That's one thing that I don't know that we actually mentioned specifically. We're going to maybe even test this here with, we'll see. Hopefully I'm not speaking too early, but Chris is prepping this year.
Yeah.
And we have some ways to test hydration status and how water drops off when you do a peak week protocol like we've got in the paper. And you may have seen this too, is that when I do practice runs with people, you see the water drops off more rapidly the leaner they are. And that's, I think, more than likely because as the body fat, the subcutaneous body fat in particular, goes down, the space that's there as the connective tissue of the adipose starts to shrink in. When the actual storage of triglyceride in those cells gets smaller, that space becomes smaller and smaller. So those places where that sub-Q water would go, is the volume becomes less. So you don't have as much sub-Q water. You can get dehydrated, more easily, of course. So we're going to sort of test that out. And you see that, just like someone who's really, really in shape, you may gain 2 or 3 pounds of water over the course of a day, and you wake up just absolutely bone dry.
Yeah.
The morning of. We were talking about this at Derek Oslin's gym, who I've been training with here this year, and there was a picture that I took years ago because it kind of freaked me out when I was dieting in for a show, and I wasn't even like within a month of the show. But maybe I'd done a show before, but I think I was like 6 weeks out from the actual main show I wanted to do. And my glutes were striated all the way across. And I was real thirsty for some reason. This is in Arizona. I may have been out in the heat that day. And I drank a gallon of water overnight, like literally getting up and sleeping. And I woke up that day, maybe did a little work. And I went and looked I did some posing in the morning. I looked and I looked crazy freaky, like dry as anything. And it was just because I was so lean. So anyway, the main point there is that all of these manipulations don't need to all be employed necessarily. And to make sure you're not overdoing it or doing something that's not right, we've suggested, and this is something that I really have harped on for years, doing a practice run.
Yeah.
The nice thing about the protocol we have in there is that practice run can be done repeatedly. And I've done this with clients for years and years and years, because there's no pharmaceutical diuretics necessary to make the process happen. And that, from what I've seen, I think it's such an insult to the kidneys and to the system in general, especially, for the kind of old school way of doing things where you start putting in aldactone early in the week. And, when in drug, in the non-tested organizations, you have major water rebound. You literally, even 2 weeks later, trying to do what you once did isn't going to evoke the same responses, right? Because you just haven't regained water fluid homeostasis, whether that's a kidney injury that's repairing itself, or just something that has a half-life of restoration. I don't know, that is a matter of 5 or 6 days. Either way, especially week to week, doing that without having to do it the way many coaches do, which is literally watching every single day and adjusting on the fly, very particularly, hoping you can sort of nail things. So what we've got in there, it makes the presumption you're not trying to add any of those things in, pharmaceutical diuretics. Instead, using things like B vitamins, vitamin C, caffeine, of course, which is pretty harmless. Obviously, it's probably the most used drug worldwide, I think.
Yeah.
So those sorts of things allow for a repeatable testing process. So you can see if 2 weeks out, you should obviously hopefully be in shape or really, really close. And if you don't get what happens too, if you don't get a good effect, like literally on your mock show day, what you want, you may look better just after dropping your carbs for a few days, which is something we do at the beginning to precede the carbohydrate loading that happens midweek. So you may find that, just a couple of days of dropping the carbs, I look great. Or maybe after loading, I look really good for some reason, like that afternoon when I'm trying to drop more water. That's a good place to be. So you can recreate some portion of what we got, and you've got literally different looks you're going to have throughout the course of that week, which will inform you as to what you may need to do in sort of just a partial set of manipulations that work for you, rather than the whole week's long strategy that we put forth in the paper. So, but those are the main ideas, and some nuances of whether you should or shouldn't do it, or how much of what we put forth really is you should do, depending on what you see with that important practice week.
I love all the initial caveats, because I think it is important, like you said, like being in shape. It's important to be in shape. It's important to test this thing and not place too much value on it, and understand that, if you are tweaking things, like multiple things that you talked about there, they're things that want to have been tried and tested before. Otherwise, like, it's going to become a really stressful thing, which is also something you talked about. Like, I loved the review because I was like, you've gone over training, you've gone over cardio, you've gone over sleep and stress. Like, you covered every kind of, and supplements, things that maybe sometimes don't get covered. So I really loved the review, because I've done podcasts that have been like 2 hours long, and we still haven't covered all these things, which just tells the audience at least the amount of detail that you've put in here. And actually, with your book, you've gone into even more detail than even the paper, which is awesome. So, I mean, if people are interested to learn more, they should be checking out your Be Your Own Bodybuilding. Be your own bodybuilding coach. It's as simple as it is what it says on the tin. I really appreciated it as a coach, and obviously trying to do this in an evidence-based way, but also all the kind of caveats, like you said, you've got one format here, which maybe someone would name like a deplete with a kind of a mid load or something, because there's loads of different names, right? But like there's front loads, back loads, like rapid back loads, kind of taper up every single day. And like a lot of the principles, I think, like science, a lot of the principles you talk through within the paper are going to apply in those situations as well.
Yeah. The interesting thing too is if you look at it from the outside, you're like, oh my gosh, like we're doing, rocket surgery here, rocket brain surgery. Like, this is just like way too much. Trying to put on man on the moon and create a cyborg. It's like over the top. But with that practice run, it really is fairly simple once you sort of get everything lined up, and it doesn't become stressful. This is actually, there are times, and I mentioned this many times talking about this topic, where someone may not even really need a peak week protocol at all. What they need is a protocol, like anything. Like they just need a distraction. Yeah. And they need almost like a control peak week that isn't really intended to do much, but you still do those things. And so that just keeps them from perseverating, as well as knowing that, if you do these things and you don't go crazy overboard, like you're pretty moderate in your approach throughout the week with the loading and the depletion, you do have a strategy to follow, and you just check the boxes and you go along and do it. And you've done it once and you've seen it work. So when your weight goes up, and maybe like if you get aggressive, one thing I try to do, and I've stolen this term from Ken Hill, Skip, fill and spill. I use that in my book. Yeah. The idea that you, like, one way to sort of know without doing an MRS or a biopsy that you're full of glycogen is just if you spilled over. That will tells you something at least. Some people that do that, like, oh my God, I'm spilled. It's like, well, this is what we wanted. Now we know you're full. Was the intention, but they will freak out. But if they seen that spilling, and then the next day they see the weight drop the next morning, and then they see when they do the dry out procedure, that they dried out and then they look better than before. They look dry and full. They're like, wow, okay, that's really cool. So there's an association, hopefully, that's made between the spilling over and getting really full and big, which is sort of fun too. It's kind of like when guys will go after a show and they shitload and eat a bunch of food and they look in the mirror like the Sunday and they're like, wow, I look ridiculous. Just like full of, so great for an Instagram photo.
Yeah.
But that they're not really as dry as they would need to be in order to look best on the stage under the lights. So you get to see that en route, and you do that, and then it reduces the stress compared to, okay, we're gonna, and I've seen this. This is a classic way to do this. Is how Chris Aceto does it, so it works, but it takes a lot of attention, where you're literally checking in, like, doing a check-in and posing like every 3 or 4 hours and going meal by meal and sort of winding your way through it. And that can be done. Like if you, especially a good coach who's done it a million times, they can do that. And if you're trying to do that on your own, that's going to be more difficult for most people. In fact, almost, I mean, I wouldn't do that way, because this protocol it's basically something I started working on personally, like a couple of decades ago, just to have something in place that I knew would work. But that would just, if I would just suck to kind of like be somewhat aimless in like, so what do I do? Like, this is going to be a carb meal. This is a no carb meal. Like, I'm going to increase my water. I'm going to like to try to like juggle all those variables at once. That would be just mind bogglingly stressful and would backfire, I think. Whereas this is a protocol that you can apply without having someone who's an objective, calm outside eye, who's going to give you like step by step, like, wind our way through the darkness type sort of thing. So yeah, the stress is huge. It's a gigantic part of, you can literally, just the stress of a show, as you've probably known and maybe experienced. And I know I've seen it happen many times. It happened to me about 3 years ago. I was out of town competing, and this is when my dog Rusty was still alive, the one to whom I dedicated my book. And make a long, horrible story short, like it was like one thing after another went wrong. My plane was delayed. I was on the tarmac for like 2 hours in the heat. I got in late. I went to Walmart. They were closed somehow at 6 o'clock to get my food. Went to another place. I was in line for an hour, and then I got a call that my pet sitter has knocked Rusty in the pool, and she's panicking and freaking out. And he was biting her because she knocked him in the water, and it was dark. And I'm thinking, should I leave? I was like, okay, all this doesn't matter, but when my dog is maybe going to die, I'm thinking I need to come home. Well, I just looked horrible for that show.
Yeah.
There's nothing I really could do. The stress was just, I felt panicked for like 12 hours because I was thinking, should I get on a flight and fly home? Like, is this not worth it? So that's super important. That can't be underestimated, the extent to which stress and sort of your psychological state can play a role with all of this. We note in the section about stress and water retention, there's some interesting studies. There's one documented, it was kind of a case study, I believe, where a person put on like, it was like 15 pounds, maybe 20 pounds. I was thinking it was like 8 or 9 kilos in 48 hours, just because of a stressful situation. It increased their thirst, and the cortisol binds to the mineralocorticoid receptor. So it works like aldosterone and causes water retention. And people have seen this many times, and that's a lot of water.
That's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was with drinking, of course. It was feeding the water retention. But if you're that stressed and freaking out, which I've seen happen, it'll be way off. This is why drugs, diuretics, I think in part came into play, is because like once you've got the diuretics in there, like there's such a powerful pharmacological effect that they're going to override, whatever's going on endogenously. Think of it like, speed, methamphetamine or something like that. People stay up for days. They wouldn't be doing that if they weren't on meth. It's just driving them to stay awake. So It's overcoming, the natural biorhythms in that case. So as long as you got the stress under control, which I think a practice week helps with, then these things work really, really effectively. But they can totally backfire, from what I've seen personally. So
Yeah, absolutely. I think
yeah,
everyone can relate to, I don't know, when you're stressed, you don't feel your best. And when you don't feel your best, you don't tend to look your best either. It just like, it all comes together. And I think, yeah, like you said there, actually, where you're like, if you're doing this approach, like if you've kind of planned for it, you've tried it, you've practiced it, even doing that on your own, now you're going to be less stressed because you have an idea of how it's going to go and what to follow. Or having a coach, they can kind of take the stress off for you, because now you don't have to think, oh, I need to do this, or maybe I need to look at myself. They just kind of take that stress away.
right.
And I think that's where a bodybuilding coach, I guess, that's one of the real times they've become very valuable, is in those moments where you're a bit loopy towards stage,
Right.
because you're kind of questioning everything and you're not sure if you're flat, full, spilled, or what have you.
Yeah, and and then I'm not, everyone's different. The need for coaches, is obviously sort of, I wrote my book as the counter stance to, coach to some degree, but the thing that you can run into problems with is, and you hear the horror stories all the time of coaches who kind of abandon their clients.
Yeah, I've heard.
Just kind of vanish, so it's like, so that person isn't there. And I've seen this even personally with friends who are working with coaches, and it's like they need to hear from their coach in 2 hours, and the coach isn't there.
They're just looking at WhatsApp or their email, like
right. And the stress is rising, so yeah, that's kind of the game that you can play, I think, to some degree. But that's why the pharmaceutical diuretics work differently. I mean, I've talked with people personally who were just diced, and they said, well, and the thing that I try to say, I think I said this in my book, is like, go for an A, hope for an A+, but don't try to get an A+, because us being bodybuilders and the way we are, especially the mindset there, like, you want it all to come together. Like, you want to win the world championship. You don't want to just do really, really well. You want to get it, just nail it, and really produce something you've never seen. Chances are you're not going to produce a physique that you've never seen at any point in time throughout the course of your prep. Like, there's maybe a workout you had the week before where you're like, wow, I look amazing. Yeah. Like, that's an A. That's good. And there's scenarios where people are like, well, we'll just throw like a half a diazide in there, or we'll just throw a little bit in there. They try even a little one, not a panic maneuver, but just some little thing. And it's like, they just flatten out like crazy, because they're already ready. There's no need for that. They didn't need to do that. So having that pre-planned, like, I know I'm going to look phenomenal if I do it this way. And that sort of thing it's really, really invaluable, I think. Yeah. So, and a coach can guide you with that. Like, I do that with my folks. We do a practice run, we nail it all down, we set up the plan, and then I hang with them, but I don't need to like communicate with them every 2 or 3 hours, because they're just executing. They feed back to like, oh, it's going great. GI distress was taken care of by the digestive enzymes that we added, we didn't have before, or I cut the water off earlier and I could see my weights going where we want it to be. I'm going to be at my target weight at this time, which is what we what we're shooting for based on what happened last time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they just kind of like, things are going great on target, getting ready to hit the bullseye, which is really, really nice. Then literally my clients or somebody's bragging to me. It's like, this is awesome. This is so much fun. And it's the opposite, it's like, it really becomes enjoyable.
Yeah. Yeah.
They don't have to think, they can just be kind of mindless and know that it's all going to work, because they literally, and talk about if the idea of, this is sort of globally, but if the idea of this whole pursuit is to have some carryover in the rest of your life and to build self-efficacy, I think that's a tremendous experience in that direction. Yeah. Where you're like, look, I literally kind of like, Scott helped me. Or I have so many people who say they've used my book, and they come back to me and they use my peak week protocol and they look their best ever. There's actually been one person who used what was in the paper already.
Oh, wow.
Paper, and came back and said, yeah, that was like, literally, he came out and he I think he didn't even have time to do an actual practice run. He just, and he said he looked his best ever and got back to us. So that's awesome. It's so cool, right? Yeah. So they've done that. They figured out on their own. It's like, now I got this down. So like all that, like what ifs that you have, like going, it's like, so, I'm getting in shape, but I've still got this nebulous, peak week thing. What am I going to do? That box is checked. Once you sort of have a way to do this that fits, you run your practice run and things will be different each time, but it's not like, once I get to the door, I've still got this unknown labyrinth to navigate on my way to stage for the last 3 or 4 days.
Yeah.
Whereas with the protocol, you've got something that will work that you're 99, 95% sure of. So,
hey, Pascal here. I just wanted to take the moment to talk about our membership site. Inside, you'll find a thriving forum, an extensive exercise library, courses, presentations, and research reviews. All I need you to do is hit the link in the description below and sign up.
And I think just thinking about, a lot of people talk about refeeds, and they're almost like a bit of a, like they use that data to supply for their peak. And it, in a way, I mean, you have low days, maybe that's similar to the depletion, or you make some manipulations to make it more similar. Maybe you have 2-3 refeed days in a row. You've got your kind of practice peak almost there. You just have to, maybe if you are managing sodium and water a bit more closely, like you do in your kind of peak week there, which you also mentioned, you don't necessarily have to use these other variables as well. You can keep them steady if you want to. Like
right.
People are doing that maybe in their last month towards stage, like you said, then they are practicing almost an identical thing every week. So yeah, I think when people wrap their heads around it like that as well, it just becomes like, oh, okay, like I've been practicing this for the last month almost.
Yeah, that that sort of undulating feeding, the refeeding, or sort of periodization throughout the week, that is something that works for people. People are starting to figure that out. And I mean, I always feel like I'm just like, it's an advertisement, for things, but I can't think of a time when doing a practice run didn't push someone forward and made a quantum leap in their conditioning. It almost always does that. I just had a guy finish one just this last week, and I mean, he's like inching forward. We're looking at his skin folds, and they're all down like 3s and 4s, and maybe like one of them will move a 0.5 each time. And after the peak week, once everything had settled, he was I think he moved a millimeter on all of them, or maybe millimeter on 2 of them. It was like he moved forward just based on the skin folds, what in like 1 week, what he typically would have in like 3 as he had been. And this is when things would be tapering off, because now he's 2 weeks out from his sort of first practice show. So it moves people. And I've had people, like, to hurry them up, to give them a little boost in terms of fat loss, do a practice run, because it does that. It really does. So, and I think some of that, the way we have it set out, not that you have to do that, as you said, but when you're going 3 or 4 days, like with 0 carbs, not with the intention of trying to lose fat, and then having that refeed, whatever's going on with those refeeds that tend to help people lose fat in the long run, when it's preceded by low carb, something's going on there that we see. This is the principle, and I mentioned this in the other podcast we did. This is the principle whereby skip loads work. Ken Hill's skip loading idea. He's been doing that for decades. Yeah. That's how he diets people, basically, with this sort of a weekly type of thing. It works phenomenally well. He gets people peeled that way.
Yeah.
So yeah, you do get practice. And of course, if you're doing those refeeds, you're learning what kind of carbs you need. You're learning how to try to train with, you're basically getting some semblance of a peak week protocol. You can actually transition into that and just do 1 week that way and see how that affects you. So yeah, that's it's not that big of a jump for a lot of people if you're doing some sort of carbohydrate rotation anyway in your program.
And you mentioned it there in terms of, and we talked about it, kind of the intramuscular triglycerides and the fat loading, and how that has been something you've seen in the industry. But for at least, I don't know if it's because you mentioned in the paper actually about kind of what the percentage was in terms of intramuscular triglycerides and how much of a difference that could have on a physique that was quite well muscled. And I don't know if in the natural scene, because we're smaller, we don't have as much muscle and don't have as much kind of to gain from the fat loading, that maybe that's why it's less popular. I'm not sure, but that was very interesting to me, because I think in depletions, at least that I've seen, it tends to be like fat, protein, you keep them where they are, drop your carbs. So you're in a bigger calorie deficit. So it's almost like a depletion and like a aggressive diet into potentially a super compensation phase. But you mentioned in the paper where it's like, okay, you drop your carbs down 50 grams or below. I think it was roughly around there, and then bring the fats up to make the difference. Are you bringing fats to where the calories would have been during your low days normally, or are they bringing up to bring you to maintenance for the front half of that kind of depletion? So it's just a depletion of literally glycogen.
I'll kind of point to, there's different ways this could be done.
Okay.
One of the things that I'm not sure. I can't, to be honest, kind of the paper and what I do and what I've written about other places, because I've got articles on John Meadows' site on this and in my book
Okay.
and here. So at the point in time where you're that close to being contest ready or you're already ready, losing muscle mass is a real concern, I think. So going for like 3 days and doing full body training where you literally have, or you're creating a severe dietary deficiency, a caloric deficiency, probably is not the smartest idea. So what I would typically have people do is keep on at least something that's at the same caloric intake as they have been used to dieting on, by replacing the carbohydrate calories with fat calories, or maybe going higher. So here's where the nuances kind of come in. If someone has been dieting on a higher carb approach because that works for them, and they're low in fat in general, that person, in lieu of actually, measuring this directly in some way, is going to probably have lower, they're going to be depleted as far as intramuscular triglyceride levels in the first place. So for them, they're going to be more likely to store any extra calories coming in as intramuscular triglyceride and literally precede any carbohydrate loading. We're talking early in the week here now, on like a Sunday through Tuesday or Wednesday. They're going to be able to fat load early on in that week, potentially, while they're training. And also, hopefully, I would imagine this hasn't been studied directly. It'd be a function to some degree, probably, of the type of fats they're bringing in, with saturated being the least amenable to helping with improving insulin sensitivity, and polyunsaturated probably being the best. So, healthier fats, quote unquote, would be a good idea. And as to which fat is best, even for loading intramuscular triglyceride, is sort of an unknown, because it's such an unstudied area. But so during that week, it could be either basically maintenance calories. Would be wary of going intentionally low in calories to create a deficit, because now you're going, full body with no carbohydrate coming in. And now you're also intentionally going somewhat low in glycogen. When glycogen levels are low in the muscle, that tends to create more of a catabolic scenario. So you don't want to lose muscle en route to doing this at all. But not that you're going to lose a ton in 3 or 4 days, but you just don't want to dig so much of a hole for yourself where you're really sort of gone completely catabolic. So it kind of depends on the previous diet, how depleted you are. If you're totally diced and ready, then there's no reason at all, I don't think, to use those days for anything other than to try to prime yourself for a little bit of a glycogen supercompensation. So the thing that I think probably, because I would say, generally speaking, the natural competitors are maybe more evidence-based oriented than the geared guys. Like, you go on some of the boards and look, like, they're all about the gear, because obviously that's the prime factor. I'm like, if you look at comparison, the difference between, the best in the world at, 190, 200 pounds in natural versus the best in the world, take Big Ramy, 100 pounds more, the big difference there is, I would be wager to say, like, Big Ramy's obviously got good genetics. Maybe there's a genetic difference, but the gear is making a large part of that difference. So there's focus there. So that evidence-based perspective, I think, probably is also rooted in what the original evidence was and is, and what I think maybe practiced. I'm not disconnected with the endurance, the cycling and running world, but the original evidence was to get a super compensatory effect, you need to just whack glycogen.
Yeah.
The original studies with Bergstrom and Holtman, where they were doing the muscle biopsies for the first time, and they dropped muscle glycogen levels down to like nothing. Like, it was almost completely absent. And then you got the super compensatory effect. But that is potentially, especially in that really quote unquote depleted place in that last week, a way to bring on some overreaching that's bordering on overtraining. Like, you're gonna feel horrible. And I played with this stuff all years ago, like literally, trying to really push that, hoping then that I could just pile in the carbs, and get this like crazy filling up. And you could sometimes get that, but it was not very, it didn't help with my overall look, because I think just the stress of it all, and I felt terrible. One thing you want to watch out for too, especially if you try to over deplete, do something different, which I played with as well. We may or may not even mention it. I think we mentioned this in the paper as well, is that if you do a different type of training, let's say it's just increased in volume with the intent to really deplete during the beginning of the week, you can produce muscle damage, and that in and
Yeah,
of
you
itself,
mentioned it.
yeah, I thought we had, and that's going to have going to backfire as far as loading, probably because you're just taking those carbs, and those are supplying have a reparative role in just covering the damage that was done. There's a study that's probably cited in there that I've cited previously, showing that even like with a massive like it was like about 1,000 grams a day carbohydrate intake after a damaging bout, I believe in the calves, there was no increase in glycogen levels, stayed low. It just wouldn't, and that's probably the energy demand, and could be that the glycogen storage mechanism is impaired just because the muscle cell's so screwed up from that kind of damage. So that's an extreme situation, but somewhere in between is where people might lie. So if you overdo it, so imagine now, like you're someone that's I'm going to just deplete the glycogen like crazy, and I'm going to lose a bunch of fat. So, they're low on glycogen in the muscle, so that's going to depress anabolism, increase catabolism. They don't glycogen load because they damage themselves so much. They just set themselves way so far back. I remember doing some workouts where I was trying to like evoke the greatest compensatory effect, where they were like some of the hardest sets I've ever done in my life, and I wasn't even doing anything. I was just like totally destroyed. Like I'm thinking like, I don't know if I'm going to be like, this is like one of the hardest things I've ever done. It was just ridiculous that it'd feel that way, but I'd done that to myself. So the other point that I think is important, which I don't know that I've ever seen sort of discussed, obviously it has been in the papers, but they're relatively unknown. This is a really interesting phenomenon, is it seems that during the normal course of glycogen loading, that because there is an energy that's needed in doing so, which you might think, well, that's just going to come from the carbohydrate that's coming in. It seems that, and this is DeCombaz, is the DECOMBAZ, is the author who's done this work. He's got a nice review that we cite in the paper. Is that you reduce intramuscular triglyceride levels in the process of glycogen supercompensation. He's got a kind of a dual case study, 2 subjects where they demonstrate that same phenomenon. So intramuscular triglycerides actually are on the decline while you're loading in glycogen.
Right.
So being better fat loaded, so to speak, to precede that glycogen loading makes sense, so that you don't go even lower intramuscular triglyceride. And this, I think, is why sometimes you hear individuals say that you want to have some fat loading or eat extra fat, some with some timing in conjunction to the glycogen loading to kind of hold the load.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah, so that's, I think, the really the physiological connection between what bodybuilders have been seeing now for years and years and years, that those things work, and it also sort of gives us some understanding of what can happen when someone shitloads, for instance, the day of a show.
Right.
So you put in a shitload, which would be just the shitty food, the stuff that people eat like after the show.
Yeah.
That tastes so great, they look phenomenal before they start holding water eventually, if they keep that up. And it could be that, let's say you do the burger and fries, which is a common one. That's sort of a shitload type meal. Typically the shitload would happen before you get on stage for the first time. So it's, pancakes and bacon and all that good stuff. We'll just look on the macros now, not the sodium, et cetera, that comes with that. But that's going to taste good. You'll get a really high insulin release from that. If you look at the insulin index for foods, I think ice cream is one of the highest possible. So it's not that it's got a huge glycemic index because of the fat, but there's a cephalic response too. This is ice cream. This tastes great. We got to keep all these nutrients. This is a valuable food source because it's got fat and sugar, and we like it. So insulin, of course, is gonna help with glycogen loading, of course. And it's possible then that those fats that are coming in may mean that, let's say, I don't know the exact numbers. You could actually kind of calculate it from some of the DeCombaz studies, but if you just sort of back calculate the amount of fat that was used, but let's say that, you've got 100 grams of glycogen coming in, or glucose coming in, and you store, 50 grams of that, because some of it is just used for basal metabolism, and some of them, and then also you don't have any fats along with that. So you lose out in having to use some of that glucose for the storage process, because that's energy. There's some energy cost to that. Whereas now you take in the fat with it, and let's say from that 100 grams, now you bolster that to 70 grams are stored, because the fat is there to support the glycogen storing process, which seems to have a role. So you get a better filling out process from a given amount of carbs, not just based on the number of carbs, but the fact that you've got that insulin release, which could very well be better, and the fact that you've got the fat there supporting the glycogen storing process. So the fats are kind of a unique, it's wide open. I would love to see like just basic stuff where you could just, compare a situation where you have someone taking, take your two groups, do some sort of glycogen depletion, something is going to result in a super compensatory effect, and then compare what happens with, 500 or 1,000 grams of carbs over a given period of time with and without, half as many calories as fat, like literally devoid of fat, or just as many calories as from fat if you could. So you can have a number of different, like, is it the calories? Is it the carbs? Is the carbs plus fat? If we do the same amount of calories, let's say there'll be an interesting one too. Let's say 500 grams of carbs and 200 grams of fat, something like that. So the calories are about the same as 1,000 grams of carbs with no fat, which is better. Well, you'd think the carbs for sure, because fat doesn't help. Fat doesn't go directly to glycogen storage, but it can support glycogen storage in that indirect fashion. So maybe there's something to say for that. The issue that you run into, of course, is that the fats are going to slow the entry or the exiting from the stomach. So it's going to slow the absorption of the carbs. So if you're trying to load rapidly, which some people have to do, for instance, if they've made weight and they only have 24 hours before they get on stage or less, then you're going to have to be careful. You can only get too much in, and you're going to have some bloating. That's one of the kind of main goals of the paper, is to avoid gastric distress.
Yeah.
You've got a pregnancy syndrome going on when you're on stage. It's not going to help you look. So so that's sort of the reason why we also set it up, so that you sort of have that preparatory period, not necessarily depleting, but at least insulin sensitizing, loading the fats potentially early on to support the glycogen loading, and give yourself a day or day and a half or 2 days to do that. So you can be sure to get enough carbohydrate in rather than trying to cram it into a short period of time. And then while I'm continuing the train of thought, it's nice to know that the glycogen will stay there for 3, 4, 5 days, as long as you don't use it up. So once it's there, you're good. Once you're loaded, and that's when maybe some fats would be nice. That has to do with the day before of the dehydrating period, to drop the water that you may have retained from the carbs you took in. So fats have a unique role that I think have been neglected. So that's a really vital thing to look into.
Hi guys, Steve here. Just wanted to take a moment of your time to remind you of our online coaching service. At Revive Stronger, we pride ourselves on providing personalized service that will take your physique and knowledge to the next level. If you're interested, check the description and sign up.
I would absolutely agree. I think they have been a little bit neglected, because I think people inherently think fat, it's easily stored as fat, like the body doesn't have to work very hard to kind of deal with that. But if you're not pushing yourself into excessive calorie surpluses or what have you, and you're managing it, like you're using it in a smart way, like you said, and there's a reason people said fat holds on to seems to help hold on to the glycogen. There's a reason for that. So I really like how, if people haven't read the paper, we've kind of walked through it in terms of depleting, a couple of days of kind of loading with lower fats after you've kind of fat loaded, so you've got them available for the kind of, if they do have a role for the carbohydrate loading, and then you have that nice little kind of a cleanup day almost, and also a manipulation. That's where you're suggesting you can manipulate water and sodium, or you don't have to, but that's where you're now next kind of making a manipulation, which again, I think in the natural scene particularly, which will be the majority of this audience, that's something they won't have probably, or they might have seen people talk about it, but they've been like, let's just keep water and sodium high generally, and that's kind of, and keep it level across the week. But I don't know if you want to discuss that little bit of kind of what you might be able to do to improve the reduction of subcutaneous water retention, if there is any.
Yeah. So one thing, the question would be, and we've got a flow chart there, which one of the figures that I actually put together, because it's it's a decision-making process. If this, then that, how do I know if I'm full or I'm dry, what have you? And one thing I think people can sort of look at is if they see differences in their physique, especially in that week or the, couple weeks out, from morning until night, that sort of match body weight changes on the scale. which suggests we're talking about water there. So they look really good in the morning. Some people look better at night. That happens every once in a while. But the typical thing you'd see is you wake up and you're 170 pounds in the morning, you're 174 at night, and you look blurred over. You don't look as sharp as you did in the morning when you're lighter. So that tells you that's probably water. And it's going to distribute itself to the intracellular, and we're primarily worried about the muscle mass here, and the extracellular space. And outside the cells, the extracellular space is going to be the vasculature, as well as the interstitial spaces, in particular, the stuff that's under the skin. So that's where you want to get rid of it, because that's what's going to blur the separation in the musculature. So the idea is, like, if you're someone who if you think that is, and you could test this out, of course, with the practice run, is going to do better with dropping that extracellular water, you're in a nice scenario when you've led up to the show a day or so, 2 days before, where you've got the intracellular component kind of taken care of. You loaded all that glycogen, you brought the water in there. You're not going to use the glycogen up because you're not going to, like, pose like continuously, checking your conditioning, which is one of the issues that can be sometimes for a coach. You're running someone through those mandatories, and they do their mandatories, 5 times during the day. It's like, you're changing the physique there to some degree, maybe to its detriment. So basically the scenario, the situation, we've got sort of some numbers we've drawn from one particular study. I believe it was with wrestlers or MMA participants. And I have ways that it matches really with how I've done it. And there's a lot of variability here from what I've seen in terms of the extent to which this manipulation needs to happen. And some of it's just the person, just like there's a lot of variability in blood pressure, for instance. It's important. Like, one of the things that may affect this is the dopamine receptors that you have on your kidneys, which are highly predictive of your susceptibility to hypertension. A lot of people, that's why they give diuretics to treat hypertension, because they've got a chronic water retention issue. So this is there's a little bit of trial and error that would need to come with this. But the basic idea is that if we got that intracellular fluid component taken care of, and we can manipulate body water, generally speaking, because it's regulated about the concentration of sodium in the blood. That's the main extracellular electrolyte that you have there. So the body is trying to, and I use the thermostat example in my, or analogy in my book, and Chris Barakat wrote this section. He did a really nice job of he was very complete with it in this paper, is that the homeostat, so to speak, in the body is operating around a given level of sodium in the blood. And if you drink a bunch of water, then that dilutes the sodium, and that causes diuresis. If you don't drink too much water, and that would tend to increase the sodium concentration, the body's going to try to hold on to that. And what we can do then is, by keeping one of those variables the same, so sodium level relatively high, which gives us kind of a high starting point, and a greater range for the variability that we can create when we manipulate the water intake. So an extreme situation with these, sometimes you could sip, sometimes you just cut the water off. Kind of depends on the person to some degree. But if you have a situation where water intake is very high, sodium intake is very high, you're at homeostasis. You're still regulating, your body's figured out it's regulating around that normal level of natremia, so sodium levels in the blood. If you then reduce the sodium intake while the water intake is still high, that will cause a reduction in the concentration of the sodium. And then when the water intake is cut way back or eliminated, we have a water cut, so to speak, the body is going to want to bring that sodium level back up. And in order to do that, it's going to have to cause diuresis. And what you've done there is set up a situation where the diuresis will basically overshoot, such that in order to get the sodium concentration to its normal level, the body water levels will have to be below their normal level. And now you're dehydrated. And the hope is, and this is the way it pans out for the most part, is that you've lost extracellular fluid. In particular, you've lost that extracellular fluid that's under the skin that's blurring your definition. So that's where it's coming from in part. It's going to come from everywhere in the extracellular component. But you still got that intracellular component taken care of, because you've loaded the glycogen, you got the fat loading working for you, et cetera, et cetera. An important point there, and this is it's a sort of a side effect, but those sorts of loop diuretics, those that don't spare potassium can flatten people out really quickly, because if you're losing potassium, you're losing the intracellular electrolyte that you want to have in place. Potassium is important for glycogen loading. In fact, without it, you're not going to glycogen load. So you have to have enough potassium, because that's sort of holding the water inside that intracellular component. So you're not manipulating potassium in that period of time. You want to keep that normal for the most part. You mess around with potassium too much, you can cause heart problems. That's sort of a fair warning to people. At least here in the States, I think the potassium pills that you can buy in the drugstore, 99 milligrams, which is 1% of your daily potassium intake. Yeah, it was a very small amount. You have to take a whole bottle literally, to get, pretty close to your daily intake. So they try to make, you'd have to literally buy a whole case, I guess, of potassium pills in order to really screw up potassium levels. But that can be done with the diuretics, of course, Lasix and things like that. So that's the idea. And so that idea of water and sodium high, which they typically would be anyway, high enough so you've got room enough for variability. If things are at this level, let's say you're at 8 liters a day, and you drop things down, well, the extent to which the dehydration is going to happen is not going to be as great if you're only drinking 3 liters a day, because your body doesn't have to lose as much water to get that sodium level down to where it would be its normal level, which means dehydration in terms of total body water. So high levels of water and sodium are in place. You reduce the sodium intake, or just don't have anything that's got sodium added to it or anything with sodium in it. That reduces your sodium concentration. And when you keep the water level high, you tend to precipitate that even more, pardon the pun. And then when the water's out, then the body will diuresis, overshoot, and to bring your sodium levels back up. And that overshoot produces a whole body dehydration effect, which makes you dry. So waking up in the morning after a show, after having done that, crispy, it's like the term that I like best, is the goal there. And what I'll just toss this in so people I can imagine the answers or the questions that I get. If someone has done the protocol the way we've kind of set it out, where you're low carbs early in the week, which will tend to mean you drop water. See that with ketogenic diets, for instance. And let's say you're 200 pounds, keeping the numbers, sort of simple and easy to remember. And that's pretty dry. You look pretty good. And then you've loaded, for a couple of days, Wednesday and Thursday. So you've got, if you put 1,000 grams in as glycogen that wasn't there beforehand, and let's say you get that number, which is fairly variable, but let's say you get another 300 grams of water with that. That's 4,000 grams, 4 kilos, 8.8 pounds, in an idealized situation, added to your body weight, body mass, as muscle mass, because that's literally what it is. Let's say you then go through that dehydration procedure, and you wake up in the morning of the show and you're now 198. And these are the types of numbers I would typically see in doing this. And you kept pretty much all of that, with there's going to be some, shifting of the water across the extracellular space. But the idea is that the glycogen holds it there in place because it has an osmotic effect. And the fat load is helpful as well. So let's say a lot of that weight loss is not because you've lost volume and mass in the muscle mass. You've loaded that, you kept it there. That's because you've dehydrated so much. So now your body water is down, 10 pounds. In an idealist situation, it's probably not that much. You probably lost some intracellularly. That's an unknown too, that's worth studying. But now you're full because you loaded like a mofo earlier in the week, and now you're really dry because your weight's below that. So if you get to that midweek body weight, and then or below that on the morning of a show, presuming a morning prejudging, you're rocking. You're gonna be freaky. As long as you're in shape, you're gonna look like a freak show. It may even be flat in that scenario, in which case adding water is a breeze. You can add the water back. That's no problem. It's getting rid of it in the first place that's hard to do. So you want to talk about the head down tilt thing?
So I'm Steve Hall, founder of Revive Stronger and a coach of Revive Stronger.
My name is Pascal Flor. I'm the co-owner of Revive Stronger and also a coach, of course.
Revive Stronger has probably been going solidly for 3 years, probably, roughly about 3 years.
Revive Stronger, to me, it is becoming kind of my child, my foster child. It's the gathering and getting together of like-minded people.
We've been expanding the coaching team, which is helping us help more people, but each coach can only help a certain number of people.
Right now, it's all over the place. We have YouTube, we have Facebook, we have Instagram, but there isn't that community aspect behind that.
And so the next step for us is developing a membership site.
So basically, we want to create a family and a community that is then benefiting from another.
A really cool community for people within our little niche is going to be a website.
They will get early access to our podcast.
You can access us, ask us questions.
The community aspect, we have a forum there. You can ask questions, but also you can log your journey.
There's also going to be courses on there.
Courses, presentations on different topics. Discount of past seminar footage. We will log our journey as well. We'll start vlogging.
We're going to have documentaries.
Our entire athletic journey. Furthermore, they get access to an exercise video library.
The exercises that we love for hypertrophy and maximizing hypertrophy, we're going to go through those in depth, telling you how to execute them.
We kept them concise and also mobile friendly so that you can watch them in between your sets.
I'm super excited to grow this community. The amount of value that we're going to be delivering is huge. And I'd love you to be part of it.
You will get so much out of that.
I'll see you inside.